Alexander spoke Greek and in some ways was culturally Greek did not make him politically Greek. So these claims over territorial claims between modern Greece and the Republic of Macedon really have very little to do with antiquity. They are very, very sensitive and controversial issues. I know they will spark all sorts of claims and criticisms, but fundamentally, as a historian who has absolutely no interest either way on what the modern situation is, as far as we can tell, the Macedonians were a non-Greek people who came under very, very heavy Greek influence culturally, starting in the 6th century BC, and then in the reign of their king Alexander I, who ruled about 498 to 454 BC, the kings of Macedon, and this is a remarkable story in Herodotus, applied to the judges at Olympia, claiming that they were descended from none other than Heracles, the Roman Hercules. They also threw in King Perseus of Argos for good measure, and it was accepted that the Macedonian kings were Greek. We don't know if these claims are real or not. The Macedonian royal family did have some Greek ancestors. They intermarried with certain Greek aristocrats, and from that point onward, the Greeks regarded the Macedonians, their kings, as Greeks. That did not extend to the rest of the Macedonian population. And as I said, even the strongest supporters of Philip and Alexander might call Phil and Alex Greeks, but they ruled essentially over a barbarian people, Macedonians, who drink their wine unmixed, and we can't understand them no matter what they say. On the other hand, the royal family made a real effort to project themselves as Hellenes in certain ways. King Perdiccas II, who was the king during the Peloponnesian War, and his son and successor Archelaus, who was particularly important, he ruled from 413 to 399 BC, they made every effort to turn Pella and Vergina, that is the religious capital is at Vergina, it's the ancient city of Aegae, into Greek-looking cities. They brought in Greek artists. They started publishing public inscriptions in the Greek language. Attic Greek, that is the language of Athens, was officially adopted as the language of the Macedonian court by King Archelaus. That is a very significant point, and if one is looking for a very rough analogy, one could think of the Russian aristocracy of the late 18th and early 19th century, which used French, but was definitely Russian. One thinks of Tsar Alexander I, who, by the way, given his name, liked to style himself as a follower of Alexander the Great, and he's got a lot of company historically. Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia, loved to correct the spelling and punctuation of Napoleon because Alexander I spoke better French than Napoleon, who came from Corsica. That didn't mean Alexander I or any of his nobility were French, even though they were French in many ways, linguistically and culturally. And I think you should think of the Macedonian royal family and eventually the aristocracy along those lines, that they bought Greek products and goods, that they used Greek in diplomatic and other types of correspondence. They assimilated their gods to the Greek equivalents. They eventually begin to use the Greek title Basileus to describe their monarch. We don't really know what the Macedonian title for king is, but it was probably not Basileus in earlier ages. It comes to be used in the time of Alexander and later. And as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, in some ways, the Argeid kings of Macedon should be compared to other non-Greek peoples who came under very, very strong Greek influence, in which their kings or dynasts, sometimes they didn't have the title king, but they ruled as monarchs or strongmen, were known as Philhellenes. That is, they loved things Greek. The most telling example of that in the 4th century BC comes from Mausolus. Mausolus is the son of a local dynasty in Caria, and Caria is in southwestern Turkey today. The Carians are a native Anatolian people. It is now clear that they spoke a language that goes into the Bronze Age, and they are descended from an Anatolian people from the Hittite Age in the Bronze Age. They were in close association with Greeks, particularly Greeks settled on the shores of Asia Minor. In earliest times, Herodotus tells us that Greeks and Carians intermarried. The Carians used an alphabet that was similar to the Greek alphabet, modified for their language, but they were a distinct Anatolian people. Mausolus in 377 BC achieved a position of dominance in southwestern Asia Minor, and he ruled to his death in 353 BC. He came to control not only Caria, but a region known as Lycia to the southeast of Caria, various cities of Asia Minor, In some ways, he was seen as a far greater threat than Philip II, who was his contemporary, and the Athenians were extremely concerned that Mausolus would extend his control over the islands of Greece, notably the naval republic of Rhodes. Mausolus actually backed dissident Athenian allies in a war known as the Social War, which raged from 357 to 355 BC. And social is an unfortunate term. It means allied. It comes from the Latin socii for allied. So it doesn't mean social as we understand the word, as a society, social institutions, sociology, the way we would use it today in modern English. In any event, Mausolus really conducted himself as a Phil-Hellene king. His court used Greek. He remodeled the shrines of Caria along Greek lines. The most spectacular is Labranda, which is atop a mountain near the ancient city of Mylasa, in which there's a very active building program by him, his wife, his brothers who follow him, to turn the shrine into a Greek-looking shrine. He consults the Oracle of Delphi. He issues coins that are Greek-inspired with Greek inscriptions. He hires large numbers of Greek mercenaries. He moves his capital to Halicarnassus, the hometown of Herodotus, a Greek city, and sets up his court at Halicarnassus. He commissions the Great Mausoleum, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which is built in a Greek style, but he remains first and foremost an Anatolian monarch. He has Greek trappings, he uses the Greek language, he uses Greek mercenaries, but there's no question that he's a Carian dynast. And he doubles as a satrap for the great king of Persia, Artaxerxes II, and proves a very loyal and able satrap who extends his position into essentially a almost virtually independent monarch in southwestern Asia Minor. He is at the head of what is known as the Hectomanid dynasty. That is a family descended from a common ancestor. And his, the last Hectomanid dynast is a Queen Ada, who is ruling in Caria at the time that Alexander the Great shows up. And he favors her, puts her in control of Caria. She adopts him, that is Alexander, as her son and heir. And in 326 BC, when she dies, Caria essentially passes to Alexander. Mausolus, in many ways, is similar to Philip II of Macedon, who will be appearing in the coming lectures. That is, he is not from a Greek race. He is a monarch, both in name and disposition, but he comes to embrace Greek civilization, use Greek institutions, use Greek military technology and mercenaries to make himself one of the most effective kings in the Aegean world. And that's what the kings of Macedon themselves aspired to. That is what essentially Philip II achieved. And it's important to stress that to the Athenians in the 350s BC, Philip comes to the throne in 359 BC, saw Mausolus as a far more dangerous rival than they saw Philip II. They didn't realize what Phil had in store for them, and by the time they recognized Philip, it was too late, in my opinion. So the Kingdom of Macedon is then part of the wider Greek world. It's heavily influenced by Greek civilization, but it still technically is not really Greece. The Archaeid kings themselves, from the Greek viewpoint in 360 BC, didn't seem to pose much of a threat. For the longest time, the kings of Macedon were really quite weak. The western barons in Lynkestris, Orestis, Elamiah were essentially virtual independent kings. Any king who came to the throne in Pella had to bring these proud nobles, who were virtually kings in all but name, back under control. The kings in Pella and Aegae at the time lived very close to the sea. Today, those cities are very far inland because of the silting up of the Axius River. They were subject to easy coercion by first the Athenians, later by the Spartans and the Thebans. And it would be very, very easy for the Athenians to back a pretender to the throne of Macedon and land an army on the shores of Macedon and really complicate the succession of the Argead family. And throughout the entire of the 5th century BC, first King Perdiccas II and then his son Archelaus lived in fear that the Athenians could raise up pretenders with no problem, provide them with money and mercenaries, and overthrow the monarch in Pella. To the north and to the east were powerful barbarian peoples, above all the Thracians. The Odrysian kings of Thrace were seen for the longest time as a far greater opponent than any of the Macedonian kings, and the Thracians and Illyrians repeatedly would attack the border regions of Macedon to the north and the east, plunder these regions, carry off cattle, livestock, peasants, women, you name it. And throughout the 5th and early 4th century BC, the Archaeid kings were really not in much of a position to challenge these neighbors, who in many instances were wilder and far more barbaric and dreaded than the Macedonians themselves, who had come under a certain amount of Greek influence. And finally, the Macedonian kings, really in the whole political game of the 5th century BC, were not particularly impressive. Their king Amyntas submitted to Persian rule. When Xerxes marched through Macedon in 480 BC, King Alexander I, the man who got certified to be a Greek king of Macedon, did everything in his power to hurry the Persian army through Macedon and played a rather dubious role in the entire war in 480 to 479 BC that saw the defeat of the Persians in Greece. And Alexander I's prime concern was preserving his throne, and he really rather admired the great king of Persia. After all, it would be really great if the Archaeid king could be the equivalent of the great king of Persia and issue orders to his nobles that sometimes might even be paid attention to. Furthermore, the kings of Macedon found themselves without the kind of military power that their neighbors had. Until the military reforms of Philip II, the Macedonian army wasn't much to look at. Now, the population was large. In 359 BC, when Philip II comes to the throne, the population of the kingdom of Macedon may be twice that of Athens. Athens was regarded as the most populous city-state in the Aegean world. Maybe there were 500,000 residents in the kingdom of Macedon, somewhere between 100, 150,000 men who could be armed. But until Philip II, this army didn't amount to much. Macedonian kings depended very heavily on Greek mercenaries for infantry because the infantry in Macedon was nothing more than peasant levies. They did very little service on the battlefield. Actually, most of the time, they got in the way of the Macedonian cavalry, and there's several instances where the Macedonian cavalry would ride over their own peasants in order to close with the enemy. The cavalry was excellent, but it comprised various nobles and sub-kings from different parts of Macedon who styled themselves as great heroic figures rather than fighting as a disciplined cavalry. This too would have to be changed by Philip, who would train the Macedonian nobility to fight as professional soldiers rather than a bunch of heroes out of the Iliad. So that in terms of military potential, the Macedonians, while they had the manpower, they had excellent horses. Macedon was home to a great amount of timber, hides, and metals. It really was very, very difficult for these kings to utilize these resources, to equip an effective army, and even more difficult was to inculcate some sort of loyalty in this army where it could be used as an effective royal instrument. So in 360 BC, there wasn't really much concern that Macedon represented a distant threat. And therefore, in 360 BC, the year I chose to state that everyone in the Greek world at that point realized that Athens, Sparta, and Thebes had essentially fought themselves to a standstill. In 360 BC, Macedon was of very little account. And in the next year, 359 BC, news would have been received by the Greek city-states that the then ruling king of Macedon, a fellow named Perdiccas III, had been killed in a battle against the Illyrians, that some 4,000 Macedonians had fallen in the battle, that the Illyrians had plundered northern Macedon, driving off livestock and peasants, that the Thracians had overrun certain regions of Macedon, that at least 2 different pretenders appeared, one of them backed by the Athenians. The lords of Western Macedon refused to recognize Pella, and the man who was elected or chosen king, Philip II, who was the brother of Perdiccas III, was just one more Macedonian king, and this was politics as usual. Macedonian kings always faced these difficulties when they came to the throne. They faced rivals in Western Macedon, barbarians on the frontiers, pretenders backed by Athens or whoever was the leading Greek city-state. And so they gave very little concern to this. Little did they know that the king who came to the throne in 359 BC would build on Macedonian institutions, royal institutions going back into the 5th century BC, would forge a whole new army that required a virtual social and economic rewrite of Macedon and would make himself the greatest king of Europe and unite Greece. His name is Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great.